afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Agina Nuruddin Little, and I'm thrilled to be here with you this afternoon. It's wonderful to welcome you to our October learning session. As a reminder, or for those joining us for the first time, our learning series offers optional touch points where we invite thought leaders to share their work and perspectives on issues that are either responsive to our partners' needs or reflect emerging trends and solutions that may be of interest across our ecosystem. We've heard from many of you that communication is a key area of focus right now. As leaders across the Spring Point Partners community, you shared some of the challenges you're facing while navigating an increasingly complex and unpredictable information landscape. That's exactly what today's session, the second in our communication series, following a session with Dr. Claire Wardle on misinformation, is designed to explore. Today, we are lucky to be joined by Joanne Krell and Omar Hussein, the co-founders of Defy Communications. They started Defy back in 2017 with a clear and powerful vision to partner with great people and organizations to help deliver the outcomes our society truly deserves. Defy is a boutique strategic communications firm made up of entirely senior level experts who bring decades of experience in storytelling, public engagement, and crisis and issue management across the social sector, corporate spaces, and civic initiatives. What makes Defy unique is that clients work directly with Joanne and Omar, which means they get both seasoned expertise and really thoughtful, hands-on collaboration every step of the way. For our time together today, Joanne and Omar will lead us through a dynamic session focused on the understanding the essential components of crisis readiness designed specifically for nonprofits. Their presentation will include helpful insights, followed by breakout discussions where you'll have the chance to reflect, connect, and share perspectives with one another. So ideally, please plan to be on camera for breakout sessions. I'll come back at the end of our presentation with a few closing announcements and we'll follow up with materials and resources for today's session. To make the most of our time together, we encourage you to turn your cameras on and fully engage in this amazing discussion. Now, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Joanne and Omar. Joanne and Omar?
Welcome, everyone. Omar and I are delighted to be with you. We appreciate you making time for this. We recognize what a precious commodity time is, and we aim to make the most of this for you. So today's session is when you're feeling the pressure, managing issues and crises. It's really about helping you and your team stay grounded, clear, and credible when things get tough, whether that's public scrutiny, a funder's concern, or an internal situation that suddenly goes public. The goal is not to make you crisis experts overnight. I doubt we could do that, but to build shared language and practical insights that you can use right away. We'll take a social sector and nonprofit lens to all of this. What's realistic for smaller teams? What good enough looks like under pressure? And how to lead with your organization's values in uncertain times. So let's jump into it. The truth is, we're going to go one back. Thanks. The truth is, almost every nonprofit today is navigating more external pressure than ever before, whether that's attacks on your work, particularly equity-centered work, tightening budgets, or increased scrutiny from funders or policymakers, the public, or from someone you don't even know exists. It's a really challenging time. And while crisis communications might sound like something that only big national organizations have to contend with, that's not really true. The reality is that small and mid-sized nonprofits that are often more vulnerable because you have fewer layers of staff, closer community ties, your work is on the ground, and your reputations are built on trust, are feeling it just as acutely. If there's good news, it's this. You don't have to have a big complex PR plan. You don't have to have an enormous team at the ready. What you really need is clarity. clarity about knowing when do you have a true crisis, who needs to be in the room, and what do you do when the pressure hits. This session is about that. It's about building that clarity together so that you can respond with confidence instead of with panic. So here's where we're headed today. We'll start by getting clear on what actually constitutes a crisis and what's just pressure that needs managing. And then we'll walk through a practical framework for how to respond, who should be involved, how to make decisions, and what good communication looks like under stress. From there, we'll explore a fairly simple framework, 10-minute, 10-day, 10-week model that helps you prioritize across different time horizons. So you don't try to do everything all at once. And as Agina mentioned, along the way, we'll have 2 short breakout discussions to apply the ideas to your own context. And we'll close with some takeaways, tools, and then an open Q&A. So you can ask anything that's on your mind or that you're just facing or curious about. In terms of practical learning, we're hoping that you'll take away these 5 learning goals from our session. Tell the difference between an issue and a crisis, and we can't emphasize how important this is. Number 2, avoid issue inflation. Avoid overreacting to problems that are manageable. Number 3, build a simple response framework for your team. Prioritize actions in the first 10 minutes, 10 days, and 10 weeks. And then finally, communicate with empathy, with clarity, and credibility under pressure. When we talk about crisis communications, it's very easy to jump to the worst case scenarios, the scandal, the headline, the backlash. But we think it's valuable to start with something smaller, with the idea of pressure, because pressure is constant, and you're well familiar with it. It's the everyday stress that comes with leading a mission-driven organization under scrutiny, with limited resources, and with high expectations. Pressure is what you feel when a funder asks hard questions, or a community partner expresses frustration publicly, or your staff is stretched thin. The key is not all pressure is a crisis. How you interpret and respond to that pressure determines whether it stays manageable or it escalates into something bigger. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you see this organization pressure cycle. When we talk about crisis communications, it helps to see it as part of a cycle rather than an isolated event. Every organization operates with a baseline of tension, deadlines, expectations, competing priorities, very normal. When the tension builds into pressure, can actually sharpen our focus particularly if we manage it intentionally. So for those of us that love a good deadline, you know what I'm talking about. The trouble comes when pressure spikes and it's not managed. And that's when it has the potential of tipping into a crisis. Crisis, in turn, demands recovery, rebuilding trust, learning lessons, and resetting so the cycle starts again, ideally at a steadier baseline. The goal isn't to eliminate pressure. It's to recognize where you are on the dial and to act accordingly. So this issue of issues versus crisis is something that we talk about at Defy quite a bit. We talk about it with our clients. We talk about it in the field. In crisis communications, it's one of the most critical distinctions you can make, especially early on, is whether you're facing a crisis or an issue. Because if you misdiagnose an issue as a crisis, it can drain your resources, it can escalate your stakeholder anxiety, and particularly your staff. Seeing them as a stakeholder can very much escalate their anxiety, and it can create unnecessary reputational damage. So we're going to break this chart apart. Let's start with definitions. With an issue, we're talking about a challenge, a concern, or an area of risk that requires monitoring and management, but it doesn't necessarily threaten the core functioning or reputation of the organization. But with a crisis, it is absolutely a disruptive event. It's high stakes. It threatens your operations. It threatens public trust, your reputation, or your legal standing. It requires an urgent, and a coordinated response, it is truly an existential threat. With when we talk about speed for reaction with an issue, you can often address this through your regular communication channels and planned responses. You can get vertical in a hurry here. But in a crisis, not only does it demand immediate action, but typically outside of your normal operations. So you're starting to fire on all cylinders. The impact with an issue is limited or localized typically to your operations, to stakeholders, or reputation. Not that those are easy to manage, but they're manageable. With a crisis, you're looking at a much broader and more serious situation and a potentially long lasting impact that can truly impact the durability of your organization. So true with public visibility. In an issue, this might be known to internal or limited external stakeholders, and that is really the task in front of you, is to keep it limited or maybe even turn it into a positive. We'll get into that in a bit. But with a crisis, it's often highly visible. You're under public scrutiny. The media is involved. There are a lot of things that are coming at you, and they're public. It's hard to avoid. And then that takes us to the issue of control. So when you're talking about issue management, the organization has time and agency to manage the issue before it escalates. In a crisis, your control is very much diminished. External forces, whether they're regulators or public opinion leaders, they're driving the narrative. And when you don't control your narrative and someone else does, rarely do you like the outcome. So the game here is to get on top of that quickly. So I kind of want to raise a couple of examples because I imagine you would ask that question. Here's an example of something that we would say is an issue. If you manage it well, you could turn it around. If you don't, it could turn into a crisis. So let's say there's a story about your equity work that shows up in the local paper, and it's misinformation. They have the story wrong. You know it's wrong. Your stakeholders believe it's wrong, but the damage is just sort of kind of a little bit brewing. So you very quickly have to get on top of the situation that you have. You have to quickly assess what's going on. You have to understand the facts, and you have to act fast to not let that inaccuracy go unchallenged. In this case, perhaps you'd reach out to the journalist or to the editor. You would seek a correction. You would ask them to take the story down. You would do that by showing them the facts of this and where they got the story wrong. You don't have to get exercised, but you do have to get it under control. You might reach out to other people that are in that story that are impacted. Time is not your friend in this circumstance. You have to act quickly because, as we know, the news cycle does two things. It can go viral and it can also go fast. That can work in your favor or against you. So your aim is to stop the misinformation and end this story. If you don't, you can see yourself winding into a crisis if the story doesn't end, if it gets wider reach, if other people, if your funders get implicated. Now it's starting to get outside of yourself and it's much harder to manage. But when it's an issue, you can manage it down. And by talking about it like, we've got an issue and we've got to get on top of it, your staff isn't getting exercised. You're not rushing out to your board. You are just managing in the course of work something that needs management. There's also opportunities in issues. There are opportunities in crises for sure, but I'm sure we've all heard the expression, never let a good crisis go to waste. But when something is an issue, you also can turn it. So let's say you're working on a new program as part of your organization, and you've been working toward it for months, and you're looking forward to launching it in a week or two. Most people are quite happy about this program when they hear about it. But there are a couple of stakeholders out there that maybe are less pleased for whatever reason. And a stakeholder moves to disrupt the launch by sharing news with the media first. So you either see this story in the paper, you see it online or on TV, or someone calls you and tells you about it. And instinctually, you might get your back up and think, this is a terrible situation. How are we going to manage this? And things start to escalate up. If you can escalate it down, open the aperture a little wider, figure out how you can get from your back heel to your front heel, you might think, okay, or to the front of your foot, you might think, I can leverage this. We can take what somebody else has put out there and now tell the story for good and turn it around. Tell why it's good and for whom. You reframe this story. Now you go from an issue to what could have been a crisis to an issue that's a positive opportunity. So bottom line message is there are lots of ways that issues can turn in a different direction. Don't turn something into a crisis before it is truly one by keeping the temperature low, getting the facts, and getting aligned quickly, and then acting with clarity. So I've just sort of touched on issue inflation, talked about that, but let's talk more about it because even the best intentioned organizations sometimes get caught up by this. This is what happens when, as we just talked about, we take a manageable challenge, a social media critique, a funder question, a partner disagreement. Let's say these are a little bit more negative and respond as though it's an existential crisis. It's understandable. We're close to our missions. When our values are questioned, it feels personal. We sort of want to go to the wall with the response. If you add in your staff's fear, their stress, their voice, the concern about maybe losing funding or a lack of clear process, and the instinct is really to act fast, loudly, and publicly. We would caution, don't. If you do that too quickly, you risk inflating the problems. You can wind up drawing more attention, you can confuse your audiences, and for certain, you can tire your teams. So it's really helpful to bring a discipline to pause and ask yourselves 3 questions before reacting. Who's truly affected? How visible is this? Like, really, how visible is this? And what's at risk if we take an hour or a day to assess before we act? Most of the time, you will realize it's an issue, it's not a crisis, and needs calm communication and coordination, not emergency mobilization. And if we were to leave you with one thought here, it's this. Remember, in crisis work, restraint is a skill, it's not a weakness. So we want to move to an opportunity for you to think about issues and crises in real time. We've talked about what pressure looks like in theory, but let's explore what it feels like inside of an organization. In a minute, we'll send you into breakout rooms and would ask that you share one time that your organization faced pressure. Maybe it was public criticism, maybe it was internal tension, maybe it was the fear of something blowing up. Or if you're super lucky and you haven't experienced one directly, think about a situation that you worry about happening. And then among yourselves, talk about how did you recognize it was serious? What made it stressful? And whether in hindsight it was an issue or a crisis, or whether it could even have been an opportunity. We're not going to focus a lot on opportunity today, but often when you go looking back at situations, you can find there was something in there that could have worked to your favor. This isn't a right answer conversation, by the way. It's really about noticing patterns and how pressure shows up and how we respond. So when we come back, we'll ask you to share a few themes, like what tends to trigger escalation, what instincts make us overreact, and then we'll tee up our next session as distinguishing issues from crises. And so you've got about 10 minutes, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, then we're going to move forward with our next segment. So if the first part of our time together was really unpacking crisis from a theoretical standpoint, understanding the nuances between crisis and issue and everything in between, we want to move our conversation toward crisis and action and being prepared for it. And we want to walk through a crisis readiness framework that really is comprised of 3 pillars. It's your who, as in who makes up your crisis team, the what, meaning how you or what you need to do to clarify the situation before reacting, and how, if you deem a response the necessary step, how to do it with a measure of calmness and coordination and maintaining your organizational values and DNA and what makes you you. And so with that, let's talk about the first pillar, which is who. So first off, a crisis team doesn't have to be a big structure. In fact, oftentimes it's not, even in the biggest organizations. It's very surprising how small it relatively tends to be. In this situation, I think as a best practice, you can think about keeping your crisis team relatively small, 3 to 5 people. You want a mix of perspectives. Certainly your executive or lead decision maker, someone additionally, in addition to that, someone who can communicate well. It might be your program lead. If you have a communications lead in organization, that certainly sounds like the right person. And then also ideally someone who is closest to the situation or community most affected. So you can think of that like if you have multiple programs, but the crisis is specific to one of those, it'd be the program director that you'd want a part of your crisis team. If a board member or a funder, for example, is directly involved, loop them in early, determine how you want to keep them apprised, but probably it's best not to give away the response lead on it. Just simply it's for your awareness unless the situation evolves otherwise. After your crisis team is sort of set, you want to turn your attention to the what, which is really about defining the situation before reacting. You want to ask, as we've talked about now, is this an issue or is it a crisis? Who is impacted? What facts are verified? What do we not know that we need to potentially know, which is often the name of the game in these moments. From there, you can get into the how, which really the tenets of this part of the framework is about responding calmly and intentionally, making sure you start with internal alignment. And we'll get into that a bit more shortly, but perhaps sometimes your response involves a statement, but you always want to be drafting a holding statement in case you need one. When you factor in how you want your external messaging to sound, you want to lead with empathy. You want to avoid over communicating before you have to clarify beyond what's necessary. And you, in advance, you want to know who your core audiences or stakeholders are and what's the best way to move messaging to them and have that at the ready. For smaller organizations and larger organizations, what this framework is really about is it's really a process that prevents panic and helps maintain a sense of agility while also keeping the situation grounded. Let's talk a little bit more about each of these 3 pillars though. So in terms of the who needs to be in the room, we talked about, your general sense and general flavor of who those 3 to 5 voices need to be. And it's really about a team that can basically make up an ecosystem of clarity. Folks who can work well together so they can decide with clarity, they can communicate with clarity, and when it comes time to inform internal and external constituencies, they inform clearly. Now, just the reality of the situation, it's not every organization has necessarily a communications director or a PR agency on call. So that's okay. But what matters most is knowing who your communicator is, even if it's someone who just has a steady voice, strong and pragmatic thinking and writing skills. And if you truly don't have anyone to fill that function, it doesn't mean you're out of luck. Like I know from my time at the Kellogg Foundation, when our grantees, for example, would find themselves in a situation where they needed additional communications-based support, we were often tasked with figuring out, can we support them directly ourselves, the in-house team? Can we provide them with external support, whether it's time-bound or a long horizon? But we were always looking for ways to support our organizations and community as best as possible beyond the written strictures of their grant agreement. So certainly don't be afraid to ask your funding partners for additional support. Want to talk about some basic guiding principles as well for your crisis team, or who's in the room when you are in fact facing a situation. Number one, when it comes to choosing who's in the room, choose people, not titles. Who brings clarity under pressure? Number two, that everyone knows their role once they're together, meaning, who decides, who's drafting, who's the best person to be informing internal and external audiences. And the third principle, which acts almost equally as a guidepost, the fewer voices, the fewer mixed messages. Moving to the second piece of the framework is the what. So once you have your team gathered, the most important thing you can do at that point is actually pause just long enough to get clear on what's really happening. And what you see here on the slide is really a decision protocol in many ways. It's a quick, repeatable process that helps you define the situation before reacting to it prematurely, potentially. So you start in that definitional stage where you're trying to figure out issue or crisis again. And again, this means looking at the scope of the issue, the speed in which it's moving, how widespread it is, how quickly you can address it, and then also could this realistically harm any myriad of things, from reputation of your organization to potential funding streams, and even something as dire as your mission in totality. Next on the protocol, though, you want to ask who's affected and how. This helps prioritize the communication. And maybe it's your staff that needs to hear from you. In fact, often, no matter the situation, staff have to be comprehended in your communications practices. And as a general rule of thumb, you want to make sure your staff hears from you first. There's a lot of complications that can arise if staff are hearing or coming into awareness of the situation from external channels. Number one, it might not be accurate. Number two, you don't know they know that they know. And number three, it doesn't allow you to situate and actualize your plan in the way you want. Similar to that, you want to make sure your partners and funders hear if that is in fact what the situation calls for. And just another rule of communications 101 thinking, you want to resist the urge of thinking about your audience as the general public. Crises tend to be very specific, and so your audiences should mirror and reflect that specificity. Finishing off, though, in the confirmation period, you want to figure out what you actually know versus what is hearsay, what is rumor. The sequencing of a crisis is as clear and as predictable as the sequencing of chaos. It can start any which way, it can unfold any which way. So you often need to find yourself in a continuum of making sure what you know is true or still true, asking yourself what might come next, how can we figure that out? And you want to avoid filling in gaps with assumptions. So finishing this off in the how, which is really about managing the first wave of your crisis, which can be thought of in the first hours, first day or two, really. But really, this is the first and most important move of the how is aligning internally before going public. Before you make any post, before you send any email, before you make any public statement, make sure, again, everyone's on board, from your staff to your board to your partners. If your funder or local coalition partner finds out on Twitter, it's not great. There'll be a break in trust that will only exacerbate the situation you're in. But after that internal alignment has been solidified, there are no surprises, basically. You are ready to begin prepping how you want to frame or reframe the situation. Draft a simple holding statement as early after internal alignment is reached as possible. You want to acknowledge awareness of the situation, something along the lines of, we're aware, we are assessing, and we'll share updates as soon as we can. You want to avoid speculation in your written communications or verbal communications, and certainly no defensiveness. As it is important always, because it's what makes our organizations different. We want to center empathy. We want to make sure there's accountability if necessary, depending on the situation, and make sure your mission and values show up, which is something that has to be inherent as we approach response. That's when you draft your holding statement. It's not necessarily as you put it out. So before you do that, you want to be monitoring what's going on in the ether, if you will. What's the dialogue? Track what's being said on social channels, on any email correspondence that are going by. And you want to make sure that you are able to correct misinformation once you have verified facts. Once it gets to a point where it is time now to amplify your messaging and either deploy your holding statement, conduct any, respond to any inquiries, for example. Always important reminder, stay human. We always hear about be authentic, be you. It's very easy to forget that in the moment because we don't want to say the wrong thing. But that's where our values and our missions come in, because that is inherently who we are. So keep your messages calm, clear, compassionate, and aligned with the work you do. Acknowledge uncertainty when it's real, and make sure your tone often matters. Make sure you remember that tone often matters more than the technical details. How you leave the audience feeling is often more important than what they're able to take away from it, because let's face it, the information ecosystem is very fast and tremendous depth these days. We don't retain much, but we often remember how it felt in the moment. Before we break out again, I actually want to share an example of the crisis framework in action. We're just going to have to ignore the slide on the screen for right now and acknowledge some minor technical difficulties. But when thinking about the crisis readiness framework in those three buckets, the who, what, and how, earlier in my career, I worked at a nonprofit that one of the main programs was working with undocumented students in higher ed, helping them access higher ed, and then once at a college or university, navigate it from a financial aid standpoint in the absence of a social security number. But the other thing we did was we also wanted to work with institutional leaders to create conditions for undocumented students to thrive on their campuses, while also acknowledging that there were a ton of external pressures that college presidents could face should the situation be uncovered in an unfavorable environment. Now, this is 2009, 2010, when it felt like the DREAM Act was right there within grasp before President Obama put DACA in place. And so we had this project called the Storm Center, however uncreatively titled it was. That's what it effectively was a crisis readiness framework, where we tried to create a system of crisis response for college presidents. So number one, who at their university would need to be involved should an issue arise. And it tended to take the form of certainly the president, perhaps their provost, since this was an issue centering on legality, their general counsel, their comms, VP of comms. And if a particular school within the university, school of business, school of education, so on and so forth, was uniquely involved, then the dean. And then, of course, at the center of all that would be the student. The what, how we gained clarity about the situation was we knew we had roughly 72 hours if a story broke about a student. For example, at Fresno State was one in 2009. 72 hours to gather all the facts before it moved from local to regional to national news. And so that required all those members of the crisis team maneuvering their environments to gather information as fast as possible and to coordinate holding statements with the approval of their general counsels, of course. And then in terms of the response, it was a case-by-case basis, but it tended to require the leaning in of an additional network. So what other college presidents could we pair them with to offer third-party validation to help quell certainly in-sector pressures that they were facing? And what we found is, as is always the case, there were strength in numbers. The more college presidents that spoke up in these situations, the faster everyone could move on, and the story cycle moved on as well. So with that, we want to return to our breakouts. I can't seem to get control of this, but so with our second breakout session, we're going to discuss in groups of 3 to 4 people, how crisis ready do we feel in our current moment at our respective organizations. We'll look at it from 2 frames. Number one, how crisis ready do you think your organization is in this current moment? Like, do you have a clear process or team identified, or do you have a sense of who they might be? How hard is it to convene them, which is often, by the way, a very pragmatic reality or obstacle that has to be overcome, obviously. Is there a central place where your org information or stakeholder information lives? Is it on an intranet? Is it in the cloud? Is it in your email list, so on and so forth? And have you ever discussed what crisis looks like internally and thought about what are the most likely situations? It certainly seems we live in a day and age where we are thinking about this very regularly. And then number 2, what challenges or gaps are you noticing or thinking about right now after hearing this framework or even the first part of this presentation? Just a few questions to guide you. You don't have to stay on these exactly, but we wanted to offer the opportunity for you to discuss it in smaller groups. So we'll break and we'll come back just like we did before.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope that was a productive breakout session for you. You know, one of the hardest parts of crisis management is knowing what to do when. I've been through so many dozens of crises, I can't even tell you. And I still, like, when it happens, that pit in the stomach is sort of easily identifiable as that, like, oh no, what are we going to do situation? And yet, it is pretty clear in how to approach these things. If you can get yourself into this 10-10 framework mentality, and it helps you focus your energy in the right way and know what to do when the pressure hits. So if you think about the first 10 minutes, your principal job is really to stabilize. Get your core team together, confirm the facts, use the who, what, how framework. Don't rush to post or speak. Align first. Determine who must know. And I sort of feel like I should pause here and go back to something that Omar said about stakeholders, because this is something that you could do this week with your colleagues. Put together a list of your stakeholders, because I could bet that right now, if I were to say, do you know who your key stakeholders are and how to reach them? You might say, yes, I do. Susie has X list in her head, and Dan has Y list in his head, and John has Z list in his head. And that doesn't help if any of them are on vacation or medical leave or out at meetings. If something happens, you need a place where your stakeholders are on paper, digitized, with who is their principal contact in the organization and what the contact information is. That is something that can really help you when something hits. So first 10 minutes, stabilize, gather your facts, get your stakeholders in a place where you know you can reach them. In the first 10 days, communication becomes your really top priority. But again, you don't want to overdo it. So you want to keep your stakeholders informed. You want to clarify misinformation and show accountability through your actions. Your goal is to maintain trust and consistency, even if you don't have every answer yet, and I suspect that you won't. Monitor the landscape to see if the situation is getting better or worse and to assess its durability. And to this notion of monitoring, sometimes things are really clear because you're monitoring what somebody's saying about you. But sometimes it's something sort of in your constellation. So keep your eyes soft and your ears wide to understand the landscape in which you're working so that you can draw connections, because there are lots of people out in the universe right now who are looking to draw connections to things that seem to make no sense whatsoever. So try to be one step ahead of them in that sense making of the landscape. And then in the first 10 weeks, you shift into recovery and learning. What worked? What didn't? How can you prevent a repeat? This is also the stage where you rebuild relationships and reputation, not through messaging, but through follow through. If the crisis looks long term, you may want to assign a crisis team that owns sole responsibility for managing. You want to avoid this taking over your organization. So before we talk about recovery, I just want to say this is sort of a crisis 301 kind of a session when you get into the long-term crisis implications. But if your organization is facing a long-term crisis, you really need to allocate a dedicated team, which requires reallocation, oftentimes, of responsibilities within your organization. But you can crash your organization if you have too many people. Even if you tried your best to have a crisis team of 3 to 5 people, but then other people are in and out, you really want to kind of ring fence this so you can manage your crisis while your organization continues to work. So you want to avoid letting a crisis take over the organization if things seem like it's going to be a long-term play. Crises tend to unfold over time, and our response should as well. You don't have to solve everything in the first hour, but you do have to move with intention. So on the slide that's up now, we want to talk just a bit about from response to recovery, because once that immediate response phase is over, it pains me to say it, but the real work begins, and that's recovery. This is where the organization either rebuilds its credibility or loses it quietly over time. And, Omar mentioned this before too. Tone shapes memory. This is the Maya Angelou thing, right? People don't remember exactly what you said, but they remember how you made them feel. And people might forget every statement you issued, but they'll remember whether your organization came across as defensive or grounded, blaming or accountable, panicked or compassionate. And in this moment, when we're just sort of talking about it, it's easy to think, oh, we're going to be compassionate and we're going to be accountable and we're going to be all those things. But like, your body is in fight or flight. You are in all the places that are uncomfortable, and you have to really talk to yourself with intention about how you want to come across. Be transparent. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to tell absolutely everything, but be honest about what you know and what you're learning. The talking about your learning over time really goes a long way. And maybe most of all, keep the focus on those who are principally affected. Communicate directly with them before going public. Don't let optics or fear of optics drive your response. Let your values and your empathy lead. That's really the beautiful thing about our sector, right? Very different from the corporate sector. Be who you are in this moment and let that be the first thing that people see about you. Remember, recovery is relationship work, and that's a long-term game. Follow up with staff, with funders, with community partners. Ask people, how did that response land? Did you feel heard and seen in that moment? What could we have done differently? And then, if need be, aim to do it. And make sure that you capture your lessons, what worked, what needs improvement, and bake them into your systems. Because while we would like to think that crises are a one-time thing, I think we're seeing in the last year how that's very much not the case. We go through situations, we think we're out of it, and before we know it, we've like somehow been pushed back into the soup, and it's uncomfortable. So crises are inevitable, but credibility is renewable if you handle that recovery with humility and care. And so I'm going to turn it back to Omar to get into some of the tools and templates that can help you prepare for these situations.
So our time together is almost up, but before we leave, we did want to give you three tools or resources for you all to consider as you move forward in your crisis readiness journey, if you will. The first is really a checklist or a self-audit that will help you prepare well in advance of any turbulent times you might encounter. The internal audit really is to help you make sure you and your organization and your internal stakeholders have what you need before the crisis happens. And it really starts at the people level. Do you know who's in your core response team? Does everyone know their role? You know, work through those three areas in particular. From there, you're in the almost assess stage. You need to figure out if there's a shared understanding of how decisions get made when something hits. Do you have backups just in case if your executive director, for example, or your comms lead is unavailable? Then third, from a communication standpoint, do you have a holding statement? Do you have key message drafts saved somewhere? And by this, we mean like templates, which we're about to provide you with some. Like, do you have basic building blocks that you can work with if needed? Do you have a key messages document that can be pulled from that typically is connected to your values-based language sets? And it helps also remind us as we create messages of what Joanne was just talking about in terms of being yourself. Really, your values I often think of as like your central nervous system. And as long as we can stay calm, our central nervous system can help us operate and maneuver through situations. And it's really our values that elongate us with strong spines. And then from a logistics standpoint, you know, is there a shared drive or Google Doc folder where all the materials you may need are already in there? Keep in mind when these situations hit, you're going to be adding just a ton of stuff into these folders, but your basic fundamentals are logins accessible to folks. And then of course, you know, like when you do have to communicate to your community partners or whomever, are there template emails and whatnot at the ready? This next resource is almost like a decision tree. It's more like a decision flow probably, but it gets back, it could be helpful in interpreting a situation if it's a issue or crisis. You really start in that step one, you work through the scope of speed, stop right there. You figure out if it's slow and contained, it's probably an issue. If it's fast moving, highly visible, you can proceed in pressure checking it as a crisis. In order to do that, you move into step two and you assess the stakes of the situation. What is it threatening? What could you stand to lose? Who are core audiences and how would they be affected? You assess it from low to medium or high, and depending on where you net out, again, you have a better, is it an issue? You can stop your decision making right there. If it still feels in that high or existential area, proceed in your crisis gut checking. In step three, you follow this same process in step three with visibility and verification. Is this public right now or is it still private? Sometimes it's kind of in an in-between area, but do you have all the confirmed facts or is it just speculation? Again, you move forward if there's high visibility and uncertainty. And then the last piece is you think through capacity. Do you have the people and time to manage this internally right now? Do you need additional support? How can you get that? And will this stretch you thin and risk exacerbating the situation with more mistakes? And then the last piece we wanted to give you is templated statements for just as starting points, really. You know, every situation is different, so you're going to want to tweak these as necessary. And we give them in 4 different scenarios: a general situation, which allows you to fit in the specificity of the situation or concern level, a community impact crisis, a staff or internal issue crisis, and then, you know, perhaps the top of the pyramid, an attack on mission, values, and or your work. And you feel free to use any of these 3 pieces. We'll make sure you have them. And we are happy to help in addition to anything you've heard or discussed today. But with that, I think we want to turn it all back to you for some Q&A.